People always say one night can't change your life. They've never stood in the middle of a storm with the wrong opinion about the right person. I used to believe I knew exactly who Mason Carter was. Everyone in our apartment building thought they did. He lived across the hall from me on the 4th floor, always leaving for work before sunrise in the same dark pickup truck, always carrying a plain travel mug, always greeting people with nothing more than a polite nod that somehow felt colder than silence. He was nearly 10 years older than me, built like someone who had spent his entire life fixing things with his hands instead of talking about them. And he had an uncanny talent for making every conversation feel like it had ended before it even started. If my music drifted into the hallway, he would remind me about quiet hours. If one of my packages blocked the shared entrance for 5 minutes, he'd move it without saying a word. When my friends laughed too loudly after movie night, there would be a single knock on my door, calm but unmistakably firm. I called him the annoying older neighbor every chance I got, mostly because it was easier than admitting he intimidated me. My name is Ethan Brooks, and unlike Mason, I rarely enjoyed silence. I worked from home illustrating children's books, so my apartment was usually filled with music, scattered sketch pads, coffee mugs that never seemed to stay empty, and unfinished paintings leaning against every available wall. My life was colorful, a little chaotic, and completely different from the orderly routine I imagined existed behind Mason's apartment door. We had lived across from each other for almost 18 months without sharing more than a few dozen words. As far as I was concerned, that was exactly how neighbors were supposed to be. Friendly enough to borrow a ladder, distant enough not to know your middle name. Then October arrived, bringing the kind of storm that local weather stations named days in advance. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of wet concrete, and the wind rattled every window in the building. Rain hammered against the glass so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel. My lights flickered twice while I was trying to finish an illustration of a smiling fox wearing rain boots, and then everything went dark. The soft hum of my computer disappeared. My music stopped. Even the hallway outside fell strangely quiet before a deep roll of thunder shook the entire building. I sighed, grabbed my phone for its flashlight, and muttered something sarcastic about perfect timing. As I stepped into the hallway, emergency lights cast everything in a dull amber glow. Other neighbors peeked through cracked doors, whispering about the outage before retreating back inside. I was about to do the same when a heavy crash echoed from across the hall. It came from Mason's apartment, loud enough to cut through the thunder itself. Every instinct told me to mind my own business. After all, he certainly would have expected me to do exactly that. I even reached for my doorknob, ready to disappear back into my own apartment. But another rumble rolled through the hallway, followed by complete silence from the other side of his door, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I found myself walking across the hall instead of away from it. My hand hovered over the wood for a heartbeat before I knocked. The sound of my knuckles against Mason's door disappeared beneath another clap of thunder. For several long seconds, nothing happened. I was beginning to wonder if I had imagined the noise when the lock clicked. The door opened only a few inches before stopping. Mason stood there wearing a faded gray sweater with the sleeves pushed to his forearms, a small flashlight tucked beneath one arm. His usually neat hair was slightly damp, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked less like the intimidating neighbor from apartment 4B and more like an ordinary man caught in an inconvenient evening. "Are you all right?" I asked before I could second-guess myself. His eyes shifted toward the hallway behind me, as if surprised that I was the one standing there. "I should be asking you that," he replied. "Your lights went out too." I let out a nervous laugh. "Mine did, but I heard something crash over here." A faint smile appeared so quickly that I almost believed I had imagined it. "Shelf in the kitchen," he admitted. A loose bracket finally gave up. He stepped aside just enough for me to see a cardboard box resting near the entrance and several books scattered across the hardwood floor farther inside. Nothing serious. Relief settled over me. I realized I had expected something much worse. "Good," I said. "I guess I overreacted. Or maybe you were being a good neighbor." The words caught me completely off guard. Before I could answer, another gust of wind rattled every window in the building, followed by the unmistakable drip of water somewhere behind me. I turned toward my own apartment just in time to notice a thin stream creeping beneath my front door. My stomach dropped. "That is not supposed to happen," I muttered. Mason was already reaching for another flashlight hanging from a hook near his entrance. The old roof always leaks during storms this strong, he said. The maintenance crew cannot reach the building until morning. He crossed the hallway before I had time to object. Together we stepped into my apartment, where rainwater had begun slipping through the edge of the living room window. I hurried toward it with a towel, while Mason calmly examined the frame. The seal is loose, he said after only a few seconds. Do you have duct tape? I blinked. Why would I have duct tape? He looked at me with an expression that almost resembled amusement. Fair question. Without another word, he disappeared across the hallway and returned carrying a toolbox that looked older than I was. The next 20 minutes passed in surprising silence, broken only by rain and the occasional scrape of metal against wood as he carefully secured a temporary barrier to stop the leak. I handed him towels, held the flashlight when he asked, and watched with growing disbelief as the problem slowly disappeared. You have done this before, I finally said. More times than I wanted to, he answered. My father believed every problem could be fixed if you were patient enough. I looked around my apartment, now noticeably calmer despite the storm outside. Well, I admitted quietly, I definitely would have called someone instead. Mason wiped his hands on an old cloth and glanced toward the dark windows where rain still poured across the glass. Sometimes, he said, there is no one to call. Sometimes you just learn. It was such a simple sentence, yet something in the way he said it carried a weight I could not explain. The silence that followed no longer felt awkward. It felt comfortable, almost unfamiliar, and for the first time since moving into the building, I wondered if I had spent 18 months judging a man I had never actually taken the time to know. The rain refused to let up. Every few minutes another wave crashed against the building hard enough to make the windows tremble, and the emergency lights in the hallway flickered just enough to remind us that the power could stay out all night. I walked Mason back to his apartment to return the flashlight, expecting that awkward moment when neighbors politely thanked each other and retreated behind separate doors. Instead, he looked toward the dark hallway, then back at my apartment. Your refrigerator will not stay cold much longer, he said. I made soup this afternoon before the storm started. There is more than I can finish by myself. I laughed softly. Is that your way of inviting me to dinner? He shrugged with the faintest hint of embarrassment. It seemed more practical than letting food go to waste. Practical. That was probably the most Mason answer possible. A few minutes later, I found myself sitting at a small wooden table inside the apartment I had spent nearly 2 years imagining, but had never entered until tonight. The place looked nothing like I had expected. There were no expensive decorations or perfectly staged furniture. Instead, every shelf held well-worn books, framed landscape photographs, and healthy green plants sitting beside neatly organized tools. A golden retriever with a gray muzzle slowly wandered into the kitchen, looked at me with sleepy brown eyes, and rested his head against Mason's leg. This is Oliver, Mason said while scratching behind the dog's ears. He believes everyone who visits is here specifically to see him. I smiled as Oliver wandered over and leaned against my knee without hesitation. I think I already like him more than his owner. Mason surprised me again by laughing. It was quiet and brief, but genuine. Somehow that single laugh changed the atmosphere more than anything else had all evening. We ate homemade vegetable soup with thick slices of toasted bread by the light of 2 battery-powered lanterns resting on the center of the table. Without the glow of televisions, computer screens, or phones demanding attention, conversation unfolded naturally. Mason asked about the children's books I illustrated, and I admitted that drawing animals with oversized personalities paid my rent better than the serious artwork I had dreamed about in college. He listened carefully instead of waiting for his turn to speak. In return, I asked about his job, expecting something mechanical because of the toolbox and easy confidence with repairs. I restore old houses, he explained. Mostly buildings people have forgotten. I try to give them another chance before someone decides they should be torn down. I looked around his apartment again, suddenly understanding why every piece of furniture looked repaired instead of replaced. You do not like throwing things away, I observed. He looked toward the rain streaking across the window before answering. Not if they still have something worth saving. The words lingered between us long after he spoke them. We drifted into stories about favorite books, terrible coffee, childhood pets, and the strange habits of people living in the building. I caught myself laughing more than I had expected, And each time Mason answered with another small smile that softened the quiet seriousness I had mistaken for coldness. Hours slipped by without either of us noticing. Outside, the storm continued to roar across the city, but inside that modest apartment, surrounded by warm soup, old books, and a sleepy dog stretched across the floor, I realized something unsettling. The man I had labeled as distant and difficult had been patiently rebuilding forgotten homes for a living while I had never bothered to look beyond the walls he kept around himself. Somewhere between the second bowl of soup and Oliver falling asleep against my feet, I began to wonder whether the biggest misunderstanding in our building had never been about Mason at all. It had been about me. The storm finally drifted away sometime before dawn, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale gray sky. By noon, the electricity returned. The maintenance crew repaired the damaged roof, and life inside the apartment building slowly settled back into its familiar routine. I assumed that whatever strange connection had formed during those long hours without power would quietly disappear along with the rain. Instead, something unexpected happened. The following morning, as I unlocked my apartment door to collect the newspaper, I found a small paper bag sitting neatly beside the welcome mat. Inside was a warm blueberry muffin and a handwritten note that simply read, "The bakery on Maple Street makes these fresh every Tuesday. I bought one too many. Mason." I stared at the note for almost a full minute before laughing to myself. The annoying older neighbor had apparently decided that practical gestures extended beyond fixing leaking windows. The next evening, I knocked on his door carrying 2 cups of coffee from my favorite cafe. "I accidentally ordered an extra," I said with a grin. Mason looked at the cups, then at me, clearly recognizing the excuse for exactly what it was. "That seems to be happening to both of us lately," he replied before accepting one with a smile that reached his eyes. From that day forward, our routines slowly began weaving together in ways neither of us planned. If I baked cookies while experimenting with recipes I had found online, half of them somehow ended up across the hallway. If Mason visited the Saturday farmer's market, an extra bag of fresh apples or tomatoes would quietly appear outside my door. We never announced these exchanges or made them feel like obligations. They simply became part of everyday life. Oliver quickly decided that my apartment deserved regular inspections, often wandering through my open door whenever Mason returned from work. While I pretended to complain about the large dog stealing the best spot on my couch, I secretly looked forward to hearing his paws in the hallway each afternoon. Sometimes Mason would stay for a few minutes while waiting for Oliver to finish demanding attention. Those few minutes gradually became half an hour, then an entire evening spent discussing books, old movies, or whatever strange ideas had appeared in my latest illustrations. I learned that Mason played the piano surprisingly well, though only when he believed nobody was listening. One evening I heard soft music drifting through the wall between our apartments. It was gentle, thoughtful, and filled with the kind of emotion that words often failed to carry. When I casually mentioned it the next day, Mason looked almost embarrassed. "My mother taught me when I was a kid," he admitted. "I have not played for anyone in years." A week later, he quietly invited me over after dinner. "I suppose one listener will not hurt," he said. Sitting in the warm glow of a single lamp while Oliver slept beside the piano, I listened as his fingers brought old melodies back to life. There was nothing flashy about the performance. It was honest, quiet, comforting. Watching him in that moment, I realized how little appearances revealed about a person. The stern neighbor everyone described as distant cared for abandoned houses, rescued aging dogs, grew flowers on his balcony, and carried music inside him that he rarely allowed the world to hear. I had spent months believing I understood him after exchanging only brief conversations in a hallway. Now every new day uncovered another unexpected piece of the man behind the closed apartment door. Without realizing it, I had stopped counting the things that annoyed me about Mason Carter and started noticing the countless reasons I looked forward to seeing him every single day. Autumn settled comfortably over the neighborhood, painting the sidewalks with shades of amber and gold that crunched beneath our shoes during Oliver's evening walks. Somewhere along the way, spending time with Mason had stopped feeling unusual and had quietly become the best part of my day. We still lived across the hall, still had our own routines, but the invisible wall that had separated us for nearly 2 years had disappeared so completely that other neighbors began teasing us about always being together. Mason never seemed bothered by the comments. He simply smiled politely and continued carrying 2 cups of coffee whenever we headed toward the nearby park. One chilly Saturday afternoon, while helping him organize boxes in a storage room beneath the apartment building, I found an old photograph tucked inside a worn leather album. The picture showed a much younger Mason standing beside another man about his age on the front porch of a beautifully restored farmhouse. They were both smiling with the kind of effortless happiness that only appeared when nobody expected a camera. Oliver was there too, except his muzzle was golden instead of gray. I looked at the photograph for only a moment before quietly placing it back where I had found it. Mason noticed anyway. His hands paused on the box he was carrying, and the warmth that usually rested in his expression faded into thoughtful silence. His name was Daniel, he finally said. There was no hesitation in his voice, only quiet acceptance. I sat beside him on the dusty wooden floor without saying anything. For the first time since I had met him, Mason seemed unsure where to begin. We restored old houses together, he continued after a long pause. He believed every forgotten place deserved another chance. I thought he was talking about buildings. Eventually I realized he was talking about people too. He smiled faintly at the memory before looking down at the photograph again. One rainy evening, several years ago, he never made it home from a business trip. Ever since then, storms have never sounded the same. His words were calm, almost gentle, but the sadness beneath them was impossible to miss. Suddenly, everything I had noticed over the past few weeks began fitting together. The careful way he checked weather forecasts whenever rain was expected. The silence that settled over him during thunderstorms. The reason he seemed more comfortable repairing broken things than speaking about himself. None of it had been about being distant. It had been about protecting a heart that had already endured more loss than most people ever admitted. I am sorry, I said. Quietly. Mason nodded in appreciation, but he did not ask for sympathy. Life keeps moving, he replied. Some days you move with it. Other days you simply try not to fall behind. We remained there for several minutes, surrounded by old boxes and forgotten memories, while afternoon sunlight stretched across the concrete floor. Before leaving, Mason carefully returned the photograph to the album and closed it with surprising tenderness. As we walked upstairs, Oliver happily trotted ahead as though reminding both of us that life always found reasons to continue. That evening I returned to my apartment carrying a feeling I had never expected. I no longer saw Mason as the quiet neighbor who preferred solitude. I saw someone who had loved deeply, lost painfully, and still chose kindness every single day. The realization stayed with me long after the lights were turned off, and as rain softly tapped against my bedroom window later that night, I found myself hoping that one day the sound of another storm might carry something new into Mason's life instead of reminding him only of what he had lost. Winter arrived quietly, replacing the brilliant colors of autumn with crisp mornings and streets dusted with the season's first light snowfall. Somewhere between shared breakfasts on Sunday mornings and evening walks with Oliver beneath rows of glowing holiday lights, Mason had become the first person I wanted to tell whenever something good happened, and the first person I looked for whenever a difficult day refused to end. It felt so natural that I barely noticed when my habits changed. Instead of working late into the night, I often found myself carrying my sketchbook across the hallway, knowing Mason would already have a pot of coffee waiting. Sometimes he restored antique furniture while I illustrated another chapter of a children's book, neither of us speaking for long stretches because silence had somehow become another comfortable language between us. One evening he glanced at the latest drawing spread across my notebook and smiled. "Your characters always look hopeful," he observed. I shrugged. Maybe because I want them to find endings that real people do not always get. He studied the illustration for another moment before asking softly, "Is that why you became an artist?" I looked down at the page, suddenly unsure how to answer. Nobody had ever asked me that question before. After a long pause, I closed the sketchbook. When I was younger, I began quietly. My parents believed art was a hobby, not a future. They wanted me to study business, wear a suit every day, and build the kind of career that looked impressive at family gatherings. Mason listened without interrupting. When I chose illustration instead, they stopped pretending to understand me. We still speak on birthdays and holidays, but every conversation feels like we are strangers trying to remember how we are related. I laughed softly, though there was very little humor in the sound. I spent years trying to prove that I had made the right choice. Every book I finished felt like another attempt to earn approval that never came. Mason remained quiet for several seconds before speaking. Do you still believe you need their permission to be proud of your life? The question settled into my thoughts more deeply than I expected. I looked around his apartment, at the restored wooden shelves, the carefully tended plants near the windows, Oliver sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, and the piano that had once belonged to his mother. None of those things existed because someone else had approved of them. They existed because Mason had chosen to care for them. I do not know, I admitted honestly. He nodded with gentle understanding. I spent years believing I had to stop missing Daniel before I could keep living, he said. One day I realized healing is not forgetting. It is allowing yourself to build something new without feeling guilty for smiling again. His words stayed with me long after we finished our coffee. During the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes inside myself. I stopped apologizing whenever I talked about my work. I accepted new illustration projects with confidence instead of doubt. I even mailed one of my finished books to my parents without wondering whether they would approve. I did not need their answer as much as I once had. Somehow, without offering dramatic speeches or impossible solutions, Mason had gently repaired something inside me that I had carried for years. Looking back, I realized the same quiet transformation had been happening to him as well. He laughed more often now. The piano echoed through his apartment almost every evening. Even during rainy afternoons, he no longer closed every curtain or withdrew into silence. Neither of us had set out to change the other. We had simply kept showing up, one ordinary day after another, until two lonely lives slowly became a place where both of us could finally feel at home. By the time spring arrived, the apartment building no longer felt like a place where people simply lived. It had become home in a way I had never experienced before, largely because Mason was part of nearly every ordinary moment that made life feel complete. We still never rushed anything between us. There were no dramatic declarations or carefully planned conversations about what we meant to each other. Instead, our days continued unfolding through shared grocery trips, weekend visits to local bookstores, afternoons restoring old flower boxes for the community garden, and quiet evenings where Oliver insisted on lying exactly halfway between us, as if he considered it his official responsibility. I had stopped questioning why seeing Mason smile could brighten an entire day. Somewhere along the way, that feeling had simply become my normal. Then everything shifted because of one unexpected email. I was finishing the final illustrations for a new children's series when my phone chimed with a message from a publishing company in New York City. Months earlier, I had submitted artwork for a national project and forgotten about it. They wanted me to become the lead illustrator for a brand new collection. The contract was more than generous. The opportunity was something artists dreamed about. There was only one condition. I would need to relocate to New York within 6 weeks. I read the message 3 times before the excitement slowly gave way to something much heavier. Every version of the future I had imagined over the past several months suddenly split into 2 completely different paths. That evening, I carried my laptop across the hallway, intending to celebrate the news with Mason the way we celebrated everything else. Instead, I found myself quietly placing the computer on his kitchen table. He read the email without speaking. When he finally looked up, his eyes held nothing but sincere pride. "Congratulations, Ethan," he said warmly. "You earned this." I waited for something more. Some question, some hesitation, maybe even one small reason to stay. None came. "It is in New York," I said, almost hoping he had overlooked that detail. He nodded. "I saw. That is pretty far." "It is." His calmness unsettled me far more than disappointment ever could have. "What do you think I should do?" I finally asked. Mason folded the laptop closed and slid it gently back toward me. "I think you should accept it." I stared at him in disbelief. Just like that. He offered a quiet smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes this time. "You have spent years building your career. Do not let fear convince you to stop now." I wanted him to argue. I wanted him to tell me New York could wait, or that opportunities appeared every day, or even that Oliver would miss me. Instead, he spoke with the same quiet kindness that had slowly rebuilt my confidence over the past months. That somehow hurt even more. During the following weeks, we continued our routines almost exactly as before, yet everything felt different. Every shared cup of coffee, seemed to carry an invisible countdown. Every evening walk through the neighborhood felt shorter than the last. Neither of us mentioned the approaching move unless absolutely necessary. We talked about books, gardens, and new illustration ideas instead, pretending time had not quietly begun slipping away. Sometimes I caught Mason watching me with an expression I could never quite understand, one that disappeared the moment I looked back. For the first time since that unforgettable storm had brought us together, silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like two people protecting each other from words they were both secretly afraid to say. My moving boxes slowly began filling the corners of my apartment, each one making the decision feel more permanent than the last. The lease for my new place in New York had already been signed. My start date was less than 2 weeks away. Friends congratulated me. My publisher called almost every other day with exciting updates. Everything I had worked toward for years was finally happening. Yet every success somehow felt quieter than it should have. The only person whose opinion truly mattered had never once asked me to stay. Mason continued treating every day as though nothing had changed. We still shared coffee in the mornings. Oliver still insisted on visiting my apartment before breakfast. We still laughed over terrible cooking experiments and argued playfully about whether old houses or old books deserved saving first. Anyone watching us would have believed nothing was wrong. Only we knew every ordinary moment was becoming another goodbye. The evening before my farewell dinner with a few neighbors, dark clouds gathered across the horizon. By sunset, the weather forecast warned that another powerful spring storm was moving toward the city. I stood by my living room window watching the first flashes of lightning brighten the distant skyline, unable to ignore the strange feeling that the sky somehow remembered the night everything between us had begun. A loud knock interrupted my thoughts. Mason stood outside holding Oliver's leash. "Walk with us?" he asked. We wandered through nearly empty streets while a cool wind carried the scent of approaching rain. Neither of us spoke very much. Oliver happily explored every patch of grass, completely unaware that the two people holding his leash were quietly struggling against emotions they no longer knew how to hide. By the time we reached the small park where we had shared countless cups of coffee over the past months, the first heavy raindrops began falling. "We should head back," I said. Mason nodded, but neither of us moved. Instead, we stood beneath an old maple tree that offered almost no protection from the rain now pouring around us. Finally, I turned toward him. "Can I ask you something honestly?" He met my eyes immediately. "Always." I took a slow breath. "Why? Have you never asked me to stay?" For the first time since I had known him, Mason looked completely unprepared for an answer. Rain soaked through his jacket as silence stretched between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. "Because I already know what it feels like to lose someone I love after asking them to give up a dream for me." My heart seemed to stop. He continued before I could respond. "Daniel once turned down an incredible opportunity because he thought staying would make me happier. Years later, he admitted he always wondered what might have been. I promised myself that if I ever cared about someone that deeply again, I would never be the reason they abandoned the life they deserved." The words settled over me more powerfully than the rain. "Mason," I whispered, hardly recognizing my own voice. He smiled sadly, the same gentle smile that had carried both kindness and restraint for months. "You deserve New York, Ethan. You deserve every page you will illustrate and every child who will smile because of your work. Loving someone should never mean asking them to become smaller." I stepped closer without thinking. What if leaving is the thing that makes my life smaller? He stared at me, every carefully built wall finally beginning to crumble. "Then I have been making the biggest mistake of my life." Before either of us could say anything else, Oliver nudged both our hands together with his nose, as if he had grown tired of waiting for two stubborn people to understand what had been obvious to everyone except themselves. The rain continued falling around us, gentle now instead of fierce, as though the storm itself had finally exhausted everything it had been trying to say. I looked at Mason, at the man I had once dismissed as distant, and realized that every important change in my life had begun the moment I stopped assuming I knew his story. I reached for his hand, and this time neither of us pretended it happened by accident. His fingers closed around mine with quiet certainty, warm despite the cold spring rain. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence because we had learned long ago that the most Meaningful moments rarely needed perfect words. We simply stood together while Oliver wagged his tail in delighted circles around us, completely satisfied that his work was finally done. The next morning, I called my publisher before sunrise. My heart pounded harder than it ever had during any job interview or book deadline. I explained that I still wanted the opportunity more than anything, but I asked whether the position could begin remotely for a few months while I arranged a gradual move. To my surprise, they agreed without hesitation. They had already admired my reliability and believed the schedule could be adjusted. I laughed out loud after hanging up, realizing how many sleepless nights I had spent fearing a conversation that turned out to be far simpler than the stories I had invented in my own mind. That afternoon, Mason met me in the hallway carrying 2 mugs of coffee, exactly as he had done so many mornings before. This time, instead of standing in separate doorways, we sat together on the apartment building's front steps while neighbors passed by offering cheerful greetings. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. Life did not suddenly become perfect. Deadlines still existed. Restoring old houses still demanded long days of hard work. Oliver still believed every squirrel in the neighborhood required his personal supervision. Yet everything felt lighter because we were no longer hiding what had quietly grown between us. Months passed, and my illustration projects flourished. Mason completed one of his most meaningful restorations, transforming an abandoned farmhouse into a community arts center where children could paint, read, and imagine freely. On opening day, he asked if I would create the mural that welcomed visitors through the front entrance. I painted a wide blue sky after a storm, sunlight breaking through clouds, and 2 neighboring homes connected by a winding garden path lined with blooming flowers. No explanation was necessary. He understood every brushstroke. Years later, people often asked us how we met. Some expected an extraordinary story filled with grand adventures or impossible coincidences. We always smiled before giving the same simple answer. We had been neighbors. That was all. They never realized how extraordinary ordinary moments could become when someone chose kindness over assumptions, patience over pride, and honesty over fear. Even now, whenever thunder rolls across the sky and rain begins tapping softly against our windows, Mason no longer closes the curtains. Instead, we brew fresh coffee, sit together on the porch with Oliver resting at our feet, and watch the storm drift across the horizon. Sometimes he reaches for my hand without saying a word. Sometimes I rest my head against his shoulder while the rain washes the world clean once again. I used to believe storms only arrived to interrupt peaceful lives. Now I know that occasionally they arrive to clear away everything standing between 2 people who were quietly finding their way home all along.